All right. Marina is an assistant professor at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, National University of Singapore. Her research focuses on the intersection between visuality, governance, and power. Her latest work includes 2 short documentaries, Tarnate Point Zero and Sultanates of the Spice Route, that explore interpretations of identity, tradition, and maritime heritage in Indonesia. And also the respondent tonight, Professor Tim Winter. He is the ARC Professorial Future Fellow at the University of Western Australia and the author of Geoculture Power, China's Quest to Revive the Silk Roads for the 21st Century. And he's also has a website, silkroadsfuture.net. So without any further ado, I will hand the virtual stage over to Marina. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen, for giving me the opportunity to present today. ACM has been a great inspiration for my work, and I'm honored to share some of my insights with your esteemed audience. Also, I'm excited to be on a panel with Professor Tim Winter, whose writings have been very influential for my own explorations. Let me also preface my talk by saying that although I'm a great admirer of art, archaeology, and history, I remain just that, an admirer. As you will see from the talk today, my training is in political science and political theory. As you already know, the title of my talk is Art of Maritime Heritage, the Art of Maritime Heritage. However, this title is actually misleading. I should say, a little incomplete. And if I can start moving this, yes. In fact, the title should have been, or should have had a subtitle, Whose Heritage and What Maritime? I pose these 2 questions because I want to problematize the notions of heritage and maritime, especially in the way they are used in policy circles today. What I will argue in the presentation is that there is a disconnect between government policies and representations of heritage. What I will explore at the end of the presentation are some potential ways to bridge this disconnect. In order to do that, I will first provide a very brief policy context of maritime heritage in China, India, and Indonesia. I want to interject here that I will not talk about UNESCO. Next week, Professor Tim Winter will cover this topic in his webinar. Next, I will turn to the disconnect between policies and representations, especially those visible in maritime museums. After a quick glimpse across several museums in China, India, and Indonesia, I will highlight some alternative narratives that play out in the heritage space. I will end my talk by returning to the art of maritime heritage and revisiting the questions I posed in the beginning: whose heritage and what maritime? And I will think, hopefully with some of you, through some of the ways to address these questions. Let me first start with China. Although much can be said about the construction of maritime heritage over the last few decades, I will only focus on some of the most recent developments triggered mainly by the Chinese Belt Road Initiative and its associations with the ancient Silk Road. Most of you are probably very familiar with this map representation of the land Silk Road and the maritime Silk Road, which together comprise the Belt Road Initiative. As many scholars have pointed out, the ancient Silk Road has provided much of the imaginary and legitimacy for the envisioned Belt Road expansion and the specific formulations for the land and maritime routes. Also, as many have pointed out, the 21st century maritime Silk Road closely mimics the trajectory of Admiral Zheng He's 7 journeys across the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. It is important to note that the narrative about Zheng He is that he was a diplomat who seeks to advance interactions and trade between different communities. Again, much has been written about the validity of such narratives, as well as the significance in constructing the overall narrative of peaceful interactions across the maritime corridors stretching from South China Sea all the way to Mombasa. I will not dwell on those here. Moving on to India, as you might be aware, the government of Prime Minister Modi announced a counter initiative to the proposed Maritime Silk Road, now known as Project Mossam. At the time of its launch, Project Mossam was considered, I quote, the most significant foreign policy initiative designed to counter China and was inspired by India's historical role as a focal point for trade in the Indian Ocean. To quote a little more from Project Mossam's website, Project Mossam aims to understand how the knowledge and manipulation of the monsoon winds has shaped interactions across the Indian Ocean and led to the spread of shared knowledge systems, traditions, technologies, and ideas along maritime routes. I would be happy to share more on Project Mossam in the Q&A, but let me now also turn to the last country that I'm discussing, and that is Indonesia. In Indonesia, the 21st century maritime Silk Road also triggered various policy responses. You may be familiar with the proposed maritime fulcrum meant to strategically and diplomatically position Indonesia at the center of, as the connecting power between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific. Beyond the geopolitical context and grand strategy, there was another layer at which Indonesia sought to formulate a vision for its maritime identity, and that was done through the passing of a culture law in 2017 and promotion of a national cultural strategy. The idea of the national cultural strategy is for the government to tap into the regencies and provinces in all of Indonesia and assess their traditions and culture in order to generate a broader understanding of Indonesian heritage and identity. A central component that is also recovering an understanding of Indonesia is its links and its identity as a maritime nation. Related, one of the most prominent initiatives coming out of the strategy is the formulation of the initiatives of the spice route. While it is not conceptualized as something opposing the Chinese notion of the Silk Road, nevertheless, there is a very strong push to develop the spice routes of Indonesia in the maritime space. To summarize, all three countries have sought to develop some form of foreign policy intervention on the basis of heritage and notions of the past history and interactions across the maritime space. China has used the Ming Dynasty travels of Admiral Zheng He to showcase peaceful diplomatic, cultural, and economic outreach. India has sought to counter this narrative with the reconceptualization of interactions in the Indian Ocean, focusing especially on the role of the monsoon winds and cultural exchanges. And Indonesia has similarly sought to promote its centrality in the maritime space by reviving the history of spices. There could be some amongst you who may point out that this is all pre-pandemic talk and policies, and that the reality today is quite different. I would like to argue, however, that not much has changed in terms of the Chinese government objectives to win over hearts and minds, to create a shared future for the world, for mankind. And from recent conversations with various government and academic representatives in both India and Indonesia, I would say that there is the same type of orientation today, that both Project Mossam and any engagements on the spice route continue. And let's not forget that in addition to the battle for hearts and minds, there is another important quote that summarizes in many ways what is happening in this world today, the world of ideas. And that is that it's not important whose army wins, but whose story wins. Before I turn to the disconnect between the aforementioned policies, the use of heritage, and the representations that appear in museums, let me just briefly say that the reason to explore museums is because museums are often considered to be places where the state inscribes memories and articulates connections through the museum artifacts between the past and the present. In addition, museum narratives have often been implicated as supporting or promoting the ideology of the state. So the question really is, how have states used museums to promote their new policy agendas, especially in light of these powerful reformulations of the links between the past and the present? So let me turn also to the broader level of disconnecting heritage representations and the differences between governments and museums in narrating the past. For the purposes of this talk, I will keep this to only a few examples, although there are many others, and I'm happy to discuss some of those on other occasions. Starting with China, how is the legacy of Zhanghe represented in maritime museums or museums that lay on the maritime ports of the past? What are some of the associated narratives and images? Looking at three museums, Guangdong Maritime Museum, Quanzhou Maritime, and Guangzhou Museum, not only is Zhanghe not present, but there are very different impressions that emerge from the narratives in these museums. For example, the focus of the exhibits in both Quanzhou Maritime Museum and the Guangdong Museum is on the multicultural character of the two port cities, Guangzhou and Quanzhou, and that is exhibited by both various historical records, as you can see on the left-hand side, as well as multiplicity of tombstones with different inscriptions, as you can see on the right-hand side. And instead of Zhanghe, there is also a prominent display of Ibn Battuta, who spent some time of his travels in Quanzhou. Finally, the ceramics that are exhibited as part of the Guangdong Museum, the famous Nanhai Hao shipwreck, contains a lot of information on the places where the ceramics were produced, but there are no records of the destinations or the buyers that could have provided a better glimpse of the maritime networks that operated at the time. In fact, there is one mention of Zhanghe. It only appears on a panel in the Guangzhou Museum, and that panel is the Age of Exploration. But as you can see, he is relegated to the bottom of the panel, a rather insignificant space compared to the European explorers who actually came after him. Project Mosam fares in similar ways in maritime museums and galleries in India. Although there is some attempt to indicate the existence of maritime trade and the significance of various ports, nevertheless, none of this is contextualized in relation to monsoon winds or cultural exchanges, which is the objective of Project Mosam. In the National Museum in Delhi, in the Maritime Trade Gallery, there is some notion of trade featured on some maps in the gallery. However, the most prominent place in the gallery is reserved for a display of Navy uniforms and models of ships, as you can see here on the bottom right-hand side. The Kochi Maritime Museum, there are many artistic representations of trade and narratives of various traders coming to the area because of the precious spices and gemstones. And in many ways, the story is similar to the one in Quanzhou and Guangzhou, where the multicultural character of the community is very prominent. Yet beyond the indication of trade, little is mentioned about the role of cultural interactions, monsoon winds, or what some types of maritime interactions transpired prior to people coming to the land. And turning to Indonesia and the Maritime Museum in Jakarta, there was a temporary exhibit on one of my visits that commenced at the time of launching the Spice Route initiatives. However, much of the narrative in that particular exhibit was focused on the Dutch, and there was again little explication of what exactly the maritime heritage of the archipelago was. As in the Quanzhou and Guangzhou Museum, the permanent exhibit in Jakarta, in the Jakarta Maritime Museum, showcases the convergence of people on the archipelago and, surprise, surprise, including Jangkar. As with other exhibits, the archipelago emerges as a destination rather than a part of a larger maritime network, a port, a trading post, all on its own. An entirely different type of exhibit could be seen on one of the fabled spice islands of the Moluccos, the island of Tarnate, where the museum is part of the Sultan's palace. Unlike other exhibits, here the prominence in organizing maritime interactions falls on the sultans, and it becomes clear that both the narratives and the community traditions, such as the sprinkling of flowers on the sultan's graves, that many conversations of maritime heritage need to begin with now the largely forgotten role of the sultans. This Sultan turn, in fact, allows me to explore a number of alternative narratives in the museum spaces and see the organization of memory and history from an entirely different lens. I will share just a few examples. First, going back to Jakarta, to the Maritime Museum, one example, which is arguably the most prominent and popular display amongst the young local visitors, is the figure of Laksamana Malayati, the Achenese woman general who led a woman's army against the Dutch and slaughtered their leader, Cornelius de Houtman. Not only is the exhibit not shying away from the violence, but in fact, it is allowing for an entirely different view of how Cornelius de Houtman should be remembered. Compare this image that you have on the screen, which is in a booklet in the Jakarta exhibit, with what appears in Dutch manuscripts, with de Houtman strolling casually amongst local dignitaries. Similarly, the resistance of the Kunjali Maracars against the Portuguese along the Malabar coast makes a prominent appearance in both Delhi and Kochi. But perhaps the main verdict of how the community feels about the Portuguese and Vasco da Gama in particular comes from this very unique image of the Gama in Kochi. Compare this to the standard Western portrayal of the Gama. So after giving you so many divergent representations of the past, how can we think of maritime heritage and the policies associated with it? Since the question of maritime heritage was already associated with a battle over hearts and minds and winning strategies, it is perhaps worthwhile to look at the writing of the Grandmaster of Strategies, Sun Tzu. I would like to entertain you with just a few quotes. First, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. And also, do not repeat the tactics which have gained you one victory, but let your methods be regulated by the infinite variety of circumstances. And just as water retains no constant shape, so in warfare, there are no constant conditions. So if the battle over hearts and minds is first and foremost about knowing yourself, we can think of this first question that I shared with you, what heritage, as a prompt for probing deeper in local communities' histories and memories. It could also be a way for asking, does the past, or which past, resonates with the present and resonates with whom? In addition, the prompt of knowing your opponent would bring us to thinking over whose hearts and minds are we actually trying to win? What is the goal of engaging in maritime heritage? Is this about tourism? Is it about UNESCO recognitions? Is it about a place in a new global order? Further, speaking of the differences in different circumstances, the prompt for adaptation is also a powerful reminder that at the core of maritime heritage is the maritime space. Yet, the museum narratives that I shared with you told stories about the land, the ports, the trade. Indeed, the land dominates our thinking, as you can also see here in the map. Would it then be helpful to start thinking about maritime space and maritime networks by changing our perspective? Would something like this help to recover some of the narratives about the sea and the seafaring communities? What is more, would such a shift in perspective allow us to see that formulating maritime heritage from the vantage point of the state does not hold? Would that also help us understand how to deal with contingency and uncertainty, something that seafaring communities are very familiar with? Speaking of contingency and uncertainty, and with the risk of making you extremely hungry at this point, the final observation that I will make is about maritime hospitality and care. As many in the maritime communities have pointed, hospitality is integral to their identity. It is the law of the sea to welcome and care for those who are stranded and lost. Perhaps the reason why maritime networks have existed for so long is precisely the hospitality and care afforded to strangers, traders, explorers, sailors, monks, merchants, so that they can all continue on with their journeys. And possibly the biggest question in thinking about maritime heritage is whether it could also lead to revival of the lost art of hospitality. I would be happy to hear from you and continue this conversation. Please also take a moment to visit my website that contains many more images than the ones that I've shared, my movies, and my YouTube channel. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Marina, for a very interesting overview of some of the different approaches being taken within Asia in particular, in terms of not just how maritime Silk Road or maritime heritage is being represented, but of course the disconnect, I think, is an even maybe more interesting, or just as an interesting aspect. On that, I will ask Professor Winter if you would like to respond to Marina's presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. That was a fabulous presentation, and as Stephen says, gives us an overview of what's happening out there across the region, which I think is an important perspective. And the talk makes me think about how we place this within the kind of the rise of heritage in Asia, which we've seen in the last 3 to 4 decades. And in Southeast Asia in particular, it's been a phenomena that's very much been framed around the nation state, and has often been land-centric, and the ways in which archaeology and architecture have dominated the heritage discourse. So I think what Marina points to is an interesting set of shifts. Firstly, the ways in which heritage is shifting towards oceanic and sea-based histories and maritime histories, and she problematizes that term rightfully, but also the ways in which countries and states in particular are now thinking about international connectivities and the internationalization of their own heritage discourses for themselves. So in that respect, what we're seeing is maritime history becoming a platform for heritage diplomacy. And in that respect, it's both a space of cooperation, but also a space of competition, which Marina's really neatly outlined for us. And in that respect, there's competing ideas at play, as she's identified, and that raises questions of who's shaping those narratives, as she indicates, and of course, as we all know, money talks, and therefore that raises the types of questions of who's funding these types of projects, and how does that inform the types of history that are being presented and filtering through to public debates about history and heritage at the regional and at the national level. So heritage as a history of connectivity is an interesting shift, I think, in what we're seeing in Southeast Asia and Asia more broadly today. And heritage as a phenomenon tells us perhaps more about the present than it does about the past. It's a rewriting, a recrafting of the past driven by agendas of the present often. We're seeing that in Turkey today. We saw it in India yesterday in very powerful ways. So what is driving this maritime connectivity? Well, that's, I think, and that's obviously something I'm going to talk about more next week, but certainly the ways in which connectivity is a space now where countries are trying to acquire power in different ways. And we're seeing new forms of cultural power kind of emerging around histories of connectivity. And what that means is ministries of culture are now interfacing with ministries of foreign affairs, which is quite a fascinating shift. And that's happened across a number of Asian countries in the last couple of decades, but this maritime history, maritime heritage is accelerating that. That raises really interesting questions about what's the role of cultural institutions, such as museums and heritage agencies, whether they're governmental or non-governmental. What role do they play in this? How are they being potentially co-opted into this kind of process of state-driven agendas of writing and rewriting histories? And museums, as Marina really correctly pointed out, have often been the spaces where the state can communicate its messages and create forms of citizenry. So, and in that respect, it's not just about connecting the past and the present, but it's also about projecting a future and where the future wants to go, where the country might want to go and the state wants to take its population. And that was certainly the case, what we're seeing in Belt and Road, and Singapore is a great example of that, as other places in Southeast Asia have been. So in that process, in those set of political processes, Marina rightly raises the question of, whose heritage, whose history is being represented, what stories get factored in and what stories get factored out, who gets left out of these grand histories. And if we are writing sweeping grand histories that move across regions, there's inevitably going to be some omissions, and are those accidental, are they deliberate? And we need to be aware of that, kind of raising those types of questions. And she also raised the question of what's driving this. Why is this happening? I guess some of my comments have spoken to that. And in that respect, we need to sort of think about, and what a presentation tells us is that through this idea of competing ideas, that there is no single story. There's certainly no sense that this is it's often spoken about as a shared heritage, but it's important who becomes the author of that shared heritage and that shared history. Marina rightly asks questions about how do we think about heritage? How do we think about this? Not only at a very abstract, potentially academic or museological level, but also at a more pragmatic level of understanding what are the funding factors of this, which institutions are driving this, which countries are driving this, and right down to the level of the importance of how these things get visualized. As we all know now, we live in a society where the visual is extremely powerful. So these are interesting processes at play here, and these kind of grand continental histories is a new way of thinking about history and the role it plays in present society. And I think Marina's presentation very nicely captures all of that.
Great, thank you, Tim. That's a very comprehensive summary, and actually maybe expanding quite a bit, I think, on what Marina was presenting. But Marina, would you like to address, is there any particular points that you'd like to follow up on or discuss a bit more in detail?
Maybe the only thing that I will try to address
perhaps not comprehensively, is the question of money. Tim is raising an extremely important point about funding of any of these initiatives, and that has definitely been one of the main reasons why the Chinese narrative, as probably everybody knows, has been so much more powerful than any of the other narratives. In terms of Indonesia, for example, although there was a culture law, the funding that supports exploration of local traditions has not come through. So many people have tried to organize without funding. And similarly, Project Mossam has a lot of funding challenges, with some people actually arguing that one of the main reasons why it is not working well is because a lot of the funding happens from outside government sources, which creates yet another level of tension for the project or initiative. So very valid point there from Tim.
Yeah, actually picking up on funding, and also from, obviously, as a museum curator myself, and having to, particularly with the Maritime Silk Road, I mean, this is something, of course, at ACM as well. Our first floor, looks at these topics. But I was very interested, even when we were talking before this lecture, setting it up, about when you identified that there's a disconnect, that there's this disconnect between the government policy and what the museum narratives say, which kind of struck me as strange at first. I was like, oh, okay. But thinking more about it, I wonder, is it a disconnect, or is it just a lag? Because someone who works in museums, it can take, quite a while to refresh a gallery or redesign a gallery completely. I mean, you can be up to 1 or 2 years. And that's even when you have a generous funding stream to do that, which we've been quite lucky. So I'm wondering, in places like Indonesia and India in particular, whether it's not that they don't want, it's not that they're avoiding this or that they haven't been told to do it. It's just that logistically it hasn't happened yet. I mean, China's, it's more unusual, because you would imagine, with the amount of funding and resources and capacity they have now in terms of museums, that you would think that this narrative would be coming out much more clearly. So.
Yeah, it's an excellent point, actually, and thank you for bringing it up. I struggled for quite some time to identify this as a disconnect, because I also expected exactly the opposite. And you're right that the three countries have very different circumstances, and in general have very different history and relationship to museums. And India is definitely a challenging space for museums overall. I think in general, when we're looking at the disconnect, the most interesting space, as you identified, is China, because in China, a lot of the museums clearly have the money to upgrade, if you will, to the level of a certain narrative. And I would say that, in my opinion, the strategy in China now is no longer to have one unified narrative around Zhenghe, but actually to expand and to include other narratives. Very much like what the Art of War is saying, you just move and shift around the circumstances and integrate others into your winning strategy. So I think that will be the shift if we have to look at what the government is doing. But at the same time, I would say that there's also very much a resistance from places like Quanzhou to speak about a history that is very particular to the history of that place. Mm-hmm. Because if they converge into a larger narrative, then they will have to give up some of their identity. And Quanzhou, I mean, both Quanzhou and Guangzhou, as probably many of you know, are vying for all sorts of UNESCO nominations, and those will not happen if you're converging into one homogeneous narrative. And so that's what makes the Chinese space very interesting. For Indonesia, and that's probably the last thing I'll say, I think there are many questions that we should look into. But Indonesia is interesting because they are trying to have a lot of temporary exhibits. As I said, one of the exhibits that I saw is on spices, but they only go as far as the Dutch, usually, for everything that they do, which undercuts an entire history of maritime heritage that precedes the Dutch. And that has been, in my opinion, their greatest challenge. Probably there is something similar happening as well in India, but things in India are even more complicated. So I'll not talk about that now.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's actually what you've said has sort of raised some other ideas. I mean, I think sometimes people look at government narratives and nations or museums and think that there will be this homogeneous narrative. But as you pointed out, of course, different cities or different regions within different countries will want to express their regional identity. So I guess that we're seeing that conflict between the national, the regional, and then even your work in Tarnate, the local, right? So you have these three different layers that maybe are, so maybe there's even conflict within, or contestation, maybe is a better word, within the countries themselves, never mind taking that out into the international sphere. I wonder if that's the case with India and Mawsum. It's such a widespread, geographically and temporally ambitious project that it's covering so many different cultures, even just within India, that have their own quite strong local traditions. And is that maybe part of why there's, you know, it's not maybe getting the traction that they're hoping?
Yeah, my reading also of Mawsum, and again, that's a topic of its own, is that a lot of it has focused externally rather than internally. And so it has not looked to integrate so much of what different provinces and regions can offer, but rather looking for these connections to transnational partners, so to speak, in order, again, to drive a very strategic process of UNESCO nomination. And I just want to add another thing on the lag that I have been thinking about a lot, that you help me verbalize now. Even if there is a lag, I think it's, and you're right that eventually the museums will get on with the program, so to speak. I think exploring this lag is very interesting to see what will happen before they become part of the dominant narrative, right? So that we will know what has been lost. So unless we explore this now, we might never have the chance to do that again.
Tim, have you had any other comments? Otherwise, I think we can start.
No, just that I guess just to say that we're kind of at an early stage in the curve of this. It's raising public awareness is the first kind of process we're going through of maritime histories and how to think about those maritime histories. And I think there will be a pluralization of narratives, and the state will be one actor in that. But I think there'll be multiple players that kind of, and you know, we all know about the importance of social media and how that can kind of create all sorts of divergent ways of thinking about this, because maritime affords us all sorts of interesting possibilities to rethink about in the environment, our relationship to the environment, ways of which countries have cooperated even before obviously the modern nation state system. So it does, there's the way to rethink religions and the movement of cultures across the region, as many scholars, particularly in Singapore, have highlighted. So the ways in which those ways of thinking about history, which often get discussed in the corridors of academia, can enter the public debate, I think can be a very healthy thing.
Great. All right. I've been going through the chat, and I'm just going to pick out one or two to start. But Marina, if there's any other questions you see in there that you really want to address, let me know. Actually, Natalie Pearson and then Mill both kind of asked two questions, one after each other, which kind of relate. So Natalie asks that she's interested to hear more about the concept of care in oceanic spaces, care for people, and the possibility of applying it to the more than human world. And then the comment after that was, what can ordinary citizens do to be part of our shared stories, especially if there's resistance from the state to delve too deeply into their own maritime histories and heritage? I wonder if you maybe can speak to that somewhat.
Yeah, these are really wonderful questions. Thank you very much for bringing them up. The question of care and hospitality is such an amazing question that I have only started looking into in the past 2-3 years, and especially now that I'm based in Singapore. And actually, my first encounter with the question of care and hospitality came actually from something that the Achenese did a few years ago, and then they did it again this year, which is rescuing Rohingya refugees. And their argument for doing that is because when somebody is stranded at sea, it is their law of the community that they have to help the person who's stranded at sea, because it can happen to them as well. A very similar thinking and understanding of how the community interacts with the environment, I heard in Ternate, which is one of the Maluku islands behind me. And so it was a sort of the same understanding that anybody who's a stranger and comes to your island, you have to accept them and you have to care for them. And this is how I was told Ternate is such a multicultural space where everybody's happy and everybody's hospitable. And so I think I haven't done too much work on this, but my sense is that this is something very widely spread across archipelagic communities, because by the nature of their engagement with the sea, it is sort of the logical way in which they can survive the various circumstances in which they can see themselves. Stephen, remind me of the second question, which was a very good question, but I forgot what it is.
Okay, I got it. Well, yeah, well, actually, and there's a sort of follow-up after that as well, so I'll read them both. What can ordinary citizens do to be part of our shared stories, especially if there's a resistance from the state to delve too deeply into their own maritime histories or heritage? And then our colleague Suchandra Ghosh from Calcutta, she has asked, what about maritime communities? Do their lives interest policymakers who work on maritime heritage in Indonesia and China? So sort of interrelated questions there about how do we get the local, how do we get the people that actually live on these seas into the narrative? So
let me start with the question of what can citizens do. I think that's a very exciting question, and a question that, of course, can be extremely tricky, especially when states, governments don't necessarily support how you want to understand your identity and your community. And again, the example that comes to mind comes from Ternate, the Spice Island that I visited, where young people organize themselves and find ways to understand their heritage. They don't wait on a government, they don't wait on funding. They actually actively look for grants to apply to. But the most important thing that they do is try to figure a way to entice the younger generations to be interested in heritage. And I think that's probably the most important aspect of heritage that we forget a little bit, that we have to pass the baton to the next generation. And if the next generation is not interested then there is no way to carry on the traditions of the community. And so finding powerful way to do that is probably the most rewarding thing that I've seen. Again, from examples in Indonesia, I have to say that these young entrepreneurs, so to speak, are very keen on also using technology to their advantage and using technology both to preserve for heritage preservation and also to entice the younger generations into caring for their heritage, tradition, identity. You can say that on a certain level is history light, as I would like to call it, because it's all about, is this a good spot to take an Instagram picture versus another spot? So there is this component of marketing that is not necessarily very enticing to me, but in terms of strategy into bringing in the young generation, I think that's the most important. And I would say that's true across for all the other questions that link to this one. At the end of the day, it's what can we do so that the next generation takes on the challenge of preserving heritage or understanding the meanings of heritage, problematizing them.
Great. I'm going to sort of extrapolate from one or two questions that have been asked, and also something that you touched on in your talk, but it never kind of came out explicitly, and that's of course colonialism. I mean, you talked about the Dutch, the Portuguese, and interesting ways in which the Indonesians have a very interesting relationship with their colonial past, I think, from what you've shown. And so it's interesting, like you said, that they haven't gone, they always, you know, start or stop with the Dutch. It's a very curious or interesting position. And then also there was another question about India as well, and of course, and post-colonial issues. Obviously this is a huge topic, but I'm just wondering, in terms of, if we just look at it more in terms of the maritime heritage of Asia in general, how do you think, you know, these post-colonial narratives, or even what we're now seeing as sort of decolonial narratives, how do they play into it? Is there a space, or is there alternative narratives that are emerging in sort of decolonial discourse, you know, in opposition, or just as an alternative? There's a few other questions about alternative narratives as well. So maybe in that sort of a vein, has your work encountered that, or is it are you going to look at that in more depth?
I have been looking at this so much. I haven't found much, but yes, extremely important question, and something that I bring up whenever I speak to anyone from Indonesia, speak or yell at anyone in Indonesia, because it's a very difficult shift for them to move beyond the Dutch. And again, different communities had different interactions with the Dutch, so you can't also impose a colonial narrative. Let's say, again, I'll use the example of Ternate, where both Ternate and the neighboring island Tidore had a very good relationship with the Dutch because of the sultans, and were never colonized. Right? So to them, this story of colonialization doesn't ring exactly true. But at the same time, just like many others, Ternate and Tidore, which were very prominent maritime forces in their time, were lost their maritime force because of the Dutch. And that's something that's not reflected very well in the narratives that they currently have. And to me personally, especially when we talk about maritime heritage, you need to start with your ability to travel, not with the ability of others to come to you. And so having these conversations has been my way to sort of push others into this decolonial narrative a little bit, and try to help them explore questions of connectivity, of their own traditions of what has happened to them in new ways. But it is a challenging task in many ways. The other thing, which again, I spoke about it a little bit in the presentation, and is something that I'm working on, is the matrilineal societies and also the role of women and the prominent role of women, so to speak, in the archipelago. So it's not just the Achenese, where the women were queens and admirals. A lot of other communities had very strong presence of women, and that's also something that I'm trying to work with my Indonesian counterparts, because usually when I go there for field work, I only talk to men. It's a little tragic, so I'm working on it.
Yeah, actually, that reminds me as well. Like, is people, like, people have discussed this as well. Of course, the sea is a very gendered space, right? It's a male space in terms of, yeah, and the Silk Road. And when you look at all of the examples that Marina has highlighted, they're all, of course, men, and of course, this whole idea of the ship crew and so forth usually being male. And of course, there's always stories of in many cultures of women sneaking on board, looking, dressing as cabin boys and so forth. So, but maybe that's a topic for completely another day or another lecture entirely. And we're almost out of time. Tim, I just wonder if you have any last thoughts or
yeah, this and Marina's responses really make me think about the importance of narrative to all of this, in terms of, to connect a couple of dots, I guess. So far, in terms of those three policy framings that Marina's neatly highlighted, often focus on trade, and that doesn't escape the sort of more global history of trade, which does bring us back to the kind of core periphery relations of the global sort of, or the world system that Emanuel Wallerstein sort of laid out over 500 years. And where does South Asia, where does Southeast Asia fit within that kind of bigger global history? And so if you're focusing on trade, you're always going to be coming back to those types of core periphery narratives and framings that kind of get us back to that, lock us back into that colonial framing, whether it's pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial. So that's kind of just, how do we escape those types of ways of thinking about regional connectivities? And my second thought connected to that is the ways in which discussion around care and hospitality, around so far the ways in which this history of connectivity is being discussed by governments, by policies, and the museums, is around a safe history of spice, pepper, silk, porcelain, so on and so forth. What happens when we get into the more difficult histories of slavery, refugees, migration? And that's, I think, potentially a equally productive space around which we can think about these histories for the hospitality of nations today, in terms of contemporary refugees. I mean, you look at somewhere like Qatar, that's approaching histories of slavery, and it's got a history of a museum of global slavery. And it's an interesting kind of take they've taken on that. And it's an obvious point to criticize, but it opens up some really interesting debates around how Qatar sees itself in the world and global history of slavery. So how do we approach those difficult topics, and what's the role of cultural institutions in thinking about those in way to inform their publics about the role of countries today in terms of the difficult global phenomena that we're facing through climate change, conflict, and so on and so forth?
Great. Yeah, that made me think as well. Of course, we haven't actually looked at that aspect of the sort of darker side of modernity, or dark side of colonialism, which, of course, the slave trade is one of the most prominent. I mean, we've gradually been starting to try and address it within the trade galleries. We're actually, warfare is the other one, and the arms trade. So we're going to rotate in a 16th century matchlock gun pretty soon. So again, to start to try and get those narratives in. I guess opium is another common one. So, but you're right. I think, like, whether it's the museums or scholar, or sort of these narratives in general, we tend to, it's quite it's quite a positive take, you know, on sort of global trade, which is interesting, of course, because in the last 10 years, you know, and what we're seeing in the States right now and so forth is a complete sort of, retreat, or, you know, or in a lot of even the EU. So will those type of narratives start to influence us as well is interesting. Just before we wrap it up, of course, the other thing we haven't even touched on is religion, and the fact that it's every religion in this region, well, most of them, Hinduism, Buddhism, and of course Islam, are all reach here by maritime routes. So that's, you know, it's not just goods and people, it's ideas and concepts. So that's, yeah. But again, maybe, I don't know if Marina, you want to finish up with a last comment, and then I think we'll wrap it up.
Well, speaking of religion, I actually had a slide that I took out because I thought my presentation is going to run too long. But in terms of, if we have to go back to thinking about how people were dealing with contingency, with the challenges of the sea, of course, in the past, it was always a god, a protector of some sort that would ensure that the sailors, the travelers, are safe. And this is also how we know how far they've gone, because once they reach a destination, they would usually create a temple, a shrine, to express thanks to the respective god. And so that's another fascinating way of knowing who has gone where, how they have been accepted into communities. I find the whole notion of me going somewhere and building a shrine quite impossible in this day and age. And imagine people have been doing it for quite some time. And so that's definitely another topic to explore.
Great. I think on that note, we better, it's 8:05, so we better not keep people from either their dinners or their early bedtimes.